Veolira's breath came in short, ragged gasps as she pressed herself against the cold, jagged wall of the underground tunnel. Above, the sky burned. The once proud capital of Zelther Prime, with its gleaming towers and sprawling biodomes, was reduced to a graveyard of smoke and ruin. Explosions thundered across the surface, rattling the earth beneath her feet. The Ralgith had come like a storm, and the Imperium had shattered before them. Her people were dying. She tightened her grip on the small data slate, clutched her chest. It contained everything: maps, resistance locations, emergency contacts, all now irrelevant. The Imperium had spent centuries believing themselves untouchable. That illusion had lasted precisely 3 days under Ralgith assault. The High Council had refused to surrender, believing in their diplomatic immunity, their vast fleets, their supposed allies. Fools! Veolira had watched their execution on a live broadcast an hour ago, the Ralgith general delivering his final words with a casual malice that chilled her to the bone. No mercy, no negotiations, only extermination. A hand gripped her arm, and she barely suppressed a scream. "Stay quiet," whispered Commander Lyrian, his usually proud, Zelthari features haggard with exhaustion. His golden eyes flicked toward the tunnel entrance. With a flickering glow of plasma, fire illuminated the twisted metal ruins beyond. "They're sweeping the lower levels. We don't have much time." Veolira nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Behind Lyrian, a handful of survivors crouched in the darkness: scientists, diplomats, wounded soldiers. She was no warrior, no strategist. She had spent her life in research and politics, studying the histories of long-fallen empires. And yet, here she was, about to die alongside the last remnants of her people. Lyrian motioned them forward. They crept through the tunnels, each footstep carefully placed to avoid the loose debris scattered across the floor. The silence was unbearable, punctuated only by the distant screams and the ominous hum of Ralgith drones patrolling above. Veolira's AI assistant, Kilo, flickered to life on her wrist device, his usual composed voice tinged with static. "Survival probability, 2%. Recalibrating, 1.8%. She exhaled sharply. "You're really bad at pep talks, Kilo. I'm not programmed for optimism. I am programmed for accuracy." Lyrian shot her a sharp look, and she shut up. They reached a service hatch, one of the last remaining emergency exits leading to an abandoned docking bay. If they could reach a shuttle, they had a slim, infinitesimal chance of escape. Lyrian tapped on the control panel. It flickered red. Locked. Veolira barely had time to process their failure before a deep, guttural voice echoed from the tunnel behind them. Insects, the Ralgith soldier rumbled. They spun around. Towering figures in black armor filled the passageway, plasma rifles trained on them with merciless precision. The lead Ralgith, a scarred brute with molten red eyes, stepped forward, his mandibles clicking in amusement. "Did you truly believe you could flee?" Lyrian moved without hesitation, drawing his blade in a desperate, doomed attack. The Ralgith shot him mid-lunge. Veolira choked back a cry as Lyrian crumpled to the ground, smoke curling from the hole in his chest. The other survivors pressed against the walls, shaking, knowing there was no escape. The Ralgith commander turned his gaze to Veolira. "No more running. No more hiding." He raised his weapon. "Die with whatever dignity remains." She squeezed her eyes shut. The explosion that followed did not come from the Ralgith. A deafening roar split the air, followed by the sickening crunch of metal and bone. The tunnel walls trembled violently. Veolira's eyes snapped open just in time to see the Ralgith commander hurled backward, his armor crumpling inward as an unseen force slammed into him. Chaos erupted. Figures in heavy combat armor materialized from the shadows, moving with impossible speed. Gunfire tore through the tunnel, but the newcomers didn't fight like the Ralgith, didn't move with the rigid formations of trained soldiers. They fought like predators, darting in and out of cover, striking with brutal precision. One moment, the Ralgith stood as executioners. The next, they were corpses. The battle lasted less than a minute. Silence followed, thick with the acrid scent of burning flesh. Vea Lyra remained frozen, staring at the carnage. The impossible warriors moved among the bodies, methodically ensuring none of the Ralgith survived. Their armor was unlike any she had ever seen, worn and battle-scarred, their weapons ancient yet devastatingly effective. One of them stepped forward, removing his helmet. Human. Vea Lyra's mind reeled. Humans were a myth, a relic of a forgotten past. Their empire had crumbled centuries ago, their kind driven to extinction by war and time. Yet here they stood. The human warrior was tall, his dark hair streaked with silver, his face carved with old scars. His eyes, an unervingly sharp shade of green, locked onto her with something unreadable. He crouched beside Lyrian's fallen form, checking for signs of life. Finding none, he exhaled through his nose and turned his attention to Vea Lyra. "You're Zelthari," he said, his voice rough with disuse. She could only nod. His gaze swept over the remaining survivors. Anyone hurt? Silence. No one seemed capable of speaking. The human stood and glanced at his soldiers. "Extract them. We're done here." As the other warriors moved to obey, Vea Lyra found her voice. "Who are you?" she whispered. The man regarded her for a long moment before answering. "Captain Elias Kane," he said. "Drakenborn Battalion." She swallowed. "You're human." A ghost of a smirk touched his lips. "So they tell me." It was too much. The exhaustion, the terror, the sheer impossibility of what she was witnessing crashed over her all at once. Her knees buckled. The last thing she heard before darkness took her was Kane's voice, muttering, "Well, that's new." Vea Lyra awoke to the steady hum of an engine beneath her, the vibrations unfamiliar yet oddly comforting. The air smelled of metal, ozone, and something faintly burnt. She was lying on a hard cot in a dimly lit room, her limbs aching, her mind still sluggish from exhaustion. Memory returned in pieces. The Ralgith ambush, the impossible battle, the humans. Humans. She sat up too quickly, and a wave of dizziness sent her swaying. A voice, dry and edged with amusement, drifted from the doorway. "Easy there, princess. You took quite the dive back in the tunnels." A woman leaned against the frame, arms crossed over her armored chest. Short-cropped auburn hair framed a face that was sharp in both angles and expression. A long scar cut from her left eyebrow to her cheek, giving her a perpetual look of faint irritation. Vea Lyra swallowed, steadying herself. "Where am I?" "The Black Talon," the woman answered. "Our ship. Don't worry, we haven't dissected you yet." Vea Lyra stared. The woman sighed. "That was a joke, in case you missed it. We're not monsters." There was something disarming about her tone, casual despite the strangeness of the situation. Still, Vea Lyra's instinct screamed at her to tread carefully. "And you are?" "Corporal Juno, Drakenborn Battalion," Juno said, pushing off the frame and stepping inside. "You're a rescuer, I guess." Vea Lyra's thoughts whirled. She had studied countless species, but humanity had been relegated to myth. An extinct people, a war-loving race that had burned itself out long ago. And yet, here they were, flesh and blood, walking proof that the galaxy's history had been a lie. Juno tossed a ration pack onto the cot beside her. "Eat. Captain wants to see you when you're steady." Vea Lyra hesitated but unwrapped the package. The food was bland but filling. More importantly, it grounded her, kept her hands from shaking as she tried to process what had happened. The Ralgith had conquered her world. The Imperium was in ruins. And the ones who had come to their aid were the same beings she had thought long dead. Minutes later, Juno led her through the ship's corridors, the dim lighting casting long shadows. The Black Talon was functional, devoid of unnecessary ornamentation. Every piece of equipment looked used, repaired, and repurposed as if it had seen more battles than years. They entered a command room, where Captain Kane stood over a holographic display of Zelthar Prime. His green eyes flicked up at her approach, assessing. "You're awake," he said. Vea Lyra crossed her arms, her voice steady despite the war within her. "You're human." Kane exhaled through his nose. "You keep saying that like it's an accusation. Because it should be impossible. Juno snorted, taking a seat on the edge of a table. Yeah, we get that a lot. Lyra ignored her, stepping closer to the projection. The last records of your kind date back nearly 400 years. What happened? Kane studied her, deciding how much to say. Then, with the air of a man recounting a story he'd long since grown tired of telling, he spoke. Humanity didn't go extinct, he said. We were erased. The words sent a chill through her. Kane gestured to the map. A long time ago, we had an empire. We were good at war, too good. The other species in the galaxy saw what we were capable of and decided they didn't want to wait until we turned on them. So, they made sure we never got the chance. Lyra's breath hitched. The Great Purge. Kane nodded. A coalition of civilizations, including some of the ones who just let the Ralgith tear through your world, came together to wipe us out. They bombed our planets, hunted our fleets, erased every trace of us from history. And it worked mostly. She stared at him, horrified. But you survived. Some of us. He leaned against the table, arms crossed. We've been in hiding ever since, picking off threats where we can. But we don't have an empire anymore. We're ghosts. It made sense in a way that sent ice through her veins. The Imperium had always dismissed the Great Purge as an unfortunate but necessary conflict, a war to contain an uncontrollable species. But if even part of what Kane said was true, then the galaxy had been complicit in one of the greatest atrocities ever committed. She forced herself to focus. Why help us? Kane's expression darkened. Because the Ralgith don't stop. You think your world is the only one? We've seen this before. We've fought this before. And we don't let monsters like them roam free. His words were simple, but there was an unshakable certainty beneath them. He wasn't just fighting for her people. He was fighting because it was the only thing he knew. Juno stretched, groaning. Enough history. We've got bigger problems. She flicked a control on the console, zooming in on the map. The Ralgith have deployed an entire armada. They know we're here, and they're bringing everything they've got. Lyra's stomach twisted. Then we need to leave. Kane shook his head. There's nowhere to run. Not without leading them to more survivors. She stared at the display, at the endless red markers signifying enemy ships. Then what do you propose? His gaze was steady, unwavering. We fight. She let out a bitter laugh. That's suicide. Kane's lips quirked into something that wasn't quite a smile. Yeah, but it's what we do best. Lyra looked between him and Juno, at the worn armor, the tired eyes, the weight of centuries of battle carved into their very being. This was what humanity had become. Fighters in the dark, the last remnants of a people betrayed and hunted, choosing to fight wars that weren't even their own. She had spent her life believing in diplomacy, in calculated strategy, in the power of reason. But the Imperium had fallen, and the Ralgith had proven that war cared little for civility. She took a slow breath. Then tell me what you need me to do. For the first time, Kane truly looked at her, not as a diplomat, not as a survivor, but as something else entirely. You really want to help? Yes. Juno grinned. Well then, welcome to the fight. The first explosions bloomed like dying stars, their fire spilling across the void in silent fury. The Ralgith fleet descended in perfect formation, a relentless wall of metal and death, their warships eclipsing the light of Zelther Prime's shattered atmosphere. The Black Talon and its allies, outnumbered and outgunned, rose to meet them with grim resolve. Lyra braced herself against the command console as the ship rocked violently. Warning sirens wailed through the narrow corridors, red emergency lights painting everything in a flickering glow. Kane stood at the helm, his expression unreadable, eyes tracking the battle unfolding beyond the viewport. His voice was calm despite the chaos. Shields at 60%. Target their formation gap. Juno, give me firing solutions. Juno's hands danced over the controls, her jaw clenched. Already on it, Captain. But in case you haven't noticed, we're up against a goddamn armada. Not the first time. Lyra barely had time to process his words before another impact sent her stumbling. The Ralgith were tightening their net, driving the Black Talon toward the heart of the battlefield where escape was impossible. If they fell here, there would be no one left to stop them. She turned to Kane, gripping the edge of the console. This isn't sustainable. We can't match their firepower. Kane didn't look at her. We don't need to match it. We just need to end it. Before she could ask what he meant, Juno cursed under her breath. Captain, the flagship just deployed planetary bombardment units. If they reach low orbit, Zelther Prime is gone, Kane said. But if those weapons stay intact, they'll use them on the next world. And the next. Veolyra followed his gaze to the enemy flagship. Larger than anything else in the fleet, its dark hull bristled with weaponry designed to erase civilizations in mere hours. It was the heart of the Ralgith force, the mind directing every attack. Destroying it would cripple their entire offensive. But getting close enough to do so was suicide. She exhaled sharply. You have a plan? Kane finally met her eyes. We get aboard. We take it out from the inside. Juno turned in her seat. I hate that plan. Noted, Kane said. Prep the boarding team. The next few minutes blurred together. Weapons loaded, armor secured, coordinates locked. Veolyra found herself standing alongside hardened soldiers. Human warriors who had survived centuries in the dark, each of them carrying the weight of their dead on their backs. She had never held a weapon before today. Now, a pulse rifle was strapped to her chest, its weight foreign but necessary. Kane watched her fasten the last of her gear. You don't have to do this. She met his gaze steady. Neither did you. The boarding shuttle launched into the chaos of the battlefield, weaving through the firestorm of debris and burning wreckage. Every moment was a gamble. Every second brought them closer to either victory or annihilation. When they finally breached the flagship's hangar, the impact sent a shockwave through her bones. The doors hissed open. The fighting was immediate, brutal. The Ralgith were waiting. Veolyra ducked as plasma fire tore through the air, her breath coming fast and uneven. Kane moved ahead like a force of nature, his rifle a seamless extension of his body. Juno fought beside him, her laughter sharp-edged as she weaved between cover, every shot finding its mark. Veolyra focused on survival, keeping close, using her knowledge of Ralgith systems to override security doors, disable turrets, disrupt communications. It wasn't enough. The enemy kept coming, endless, unrelenting. They pushed through corridors slick with blood, past the bodies of both friend and foe. By the time they reached the control deck, their numbers had dwindled. The Ralgith commander stood waiting. He was larger than the others, his obsidian armor etched with the history of 1,000 victories. His mandibles clicked in amusement as he regarded them. Foolish creatures, he rumbled. You think you're the first to defy us. You think your sacrifice will be remembered. Kane didn't hesitate. He fired. The shot barely staggered the Ralgith before he lunged, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Kane met him head-on, their weapons colliding in a shower of sparks. The battle raged around them. Juno fought to keep the remaining forces at bay, cutting down those who tried to reach the consoles. Veolyra worked as fast as she could, fingers flying over controls, bypassing security, unlocking access to the ship's reactor core. Kane, she shouted over the chaos. Core destabilization initiated. We have 5 minutes before this ship turns into a star. Kane drove his blade between the Ralgitha's armor plates, twisting deep. The commander let out a wet, choking snarl before collapsing. Kane staggered back, bloodied but standing. Then we need to go. Juno was already at the exit, covering their retreat as alarms blared through the ship. The countdown had begun. They ran. The flagship trembled beneath them, power conduits rupturing, flames consuming the corridors. By the time they reached the hangar, their shuttle was already lifting off. Kane shoved Veolyra forward. Get on. She turned just in time to see the doors closing behind him. He wasn't coming. Kane! She fought against Juno's grip, but the corporal held her back as the shuttle lifted off. He stood on the other side of the hangar's closing blast doors, watching them go. There was no fear in his eyes, only resolve. This is the job, he said, barely audible through the comms. The last thing she saw before the explosion consumed the flagship was him standing tall amidst the fire. The shockwave sent the shuttle spiraling, the impact rattling through her bones. When they finally stabilized, Juno's hands were tight on the controls, her jaw clenched. Veolyra turned to the viewport. The flagship was gone, reduced to nothing but debris. The Ralgith fleet, now leaderless, was breaking apart. Some ships fled. Others fought aimlessly before being torn down by the remnants of the human battalion. They had won. And yet, as Veolyra sat there, heart hammering, all she could think about was Kane's last words. This is the job. The humans had survived, not because they were stronger, but because they refused to do anything else. They fought because no one else would. She looked at Juno, who refused to meet her gaze. At the soldiers around her, battered but unbroken. Kane was gone, but humanity was still here. Veolyra closed her eyes and exhaled. She would make sure the galaxy never forgot them.